Greetings. My name is Nick McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Programming here at NewFest, New York's leading LGBTQ plus film and media organization. Thanks for joining for this live stream Q&A with brilliant director Chase Joint following our virtual presentation of Framing AGNES. In partnership with the Department of Education in New York City, we're delighted to present our third annual screening and talkback series, LGBTQ plus History and Heroes on Screen, in which, of course, Framing AGNES was part of for our March screening. This series, of course, honors and celebrates the rich legacy of trailblazers within our community. And please keep an eye out for registration info for our screenings in April and May, where we'll be spotlighting the wonderful contributions of Angela Bowen with a documentary and Polly Murray with a documentary in May. I'd like to give a massive thank you to our friends and partners at the New York City Department of Education for their support in making this program a reality, and to all the GSAs who are tuning in today. Now, please join me in welcoming the moderator for today's live stream Q&A, the coordinator of LGBTQ plus programs at the New York City Department of Education, Jude Schoenfeld.
Hi everybody. Happy to be here today. Thank you, Nick, for that introduction. I want to introduce our filmmaker today. Chase Joint is here to talk about his documentary feature, Framing AGNES. Welcome, Chase. It's so great to have you here today. I also want to shout out the GSA leaders, teachers, and students who are watching this afternoon.
Hey, Jude. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So I'm going to start with a few questions, and we will also have time at the end to answer some audience questions. You can drop that if you're watching in the YouTube chat box. First question I have for you today, Chase, is how did you hear about Agnes' story originally, and the UCLA archives generally?
So it's a long story that I'll make short, which is to say that I was on a fellowship at the University of Chicago to work collaboratively with my friend Kristen Schilt, who's a professor of sociology. And one of the requirements of that fellowship was to teach a class. And we taught a class called The Politics of Narrative Construction, and used the case study of Agnes, which is iconic in the field of sociology, as a way in which to think with students about how different disciplines can make different meaning and different conclusions with the same source material. So what happens when sociologists get a hold of Agnes's case? What happens when psychologists get a hold of Agnes's case? What happens when queer and trans people get a hold of Agnes's case? And what's remarkable is that the meaning and the significance of what arrives from those pages changes based on who's doing the interpretation. And Kristen and I, as the geeks that we are, decided to go on a mission into the UCLA archives and the private archives of Harold Garfinkel in order to see if we could find more about this iconic case. And as we explore in the film, we end up happening upon the transcripts of other folks who were at UCLA at the same time as Agnes, and were able to think together about how to tell a much more complex story.
Oh, I love that. I love that kind of looking at the research from different lenses. That's awesome. So when and how did you connect with all the amazing trans actors, artists, and historians that are in the film and a part of the film? And you just mentioned a little bit with the research, but what was that collaborative process like for you all?
Yeah, so it started with Kristen and I sorting through dusty boxes and photocopying paper upon paper upon paper. And then one of the things that was really striking to me was when I started to read these transcripts, I was far more interested in the questions being asked than the answers being given, because I understood that the doctors and researchers at the time were building profiles, ways in which to categorize trans and non-binary identifying people. And as a media maker and a media scholar, I was able to sort of think across time and connect that to the kind of meaning that was being made about trans and gender nonconforming life in the 80s and the 90s and up until today. And one of the things that also jumped off those pages to me was the resonances between folks in the late 1950s and some of the life stories of those within my shared queer and trans world. So what did it mean to encounter a trans masculine person like Henry on the page, who is writing about his life in the late 1950s, creating this document, this autobiographical account, and then to think about Maxwell Falerio, who's a transmasculine poet who wrote a memoir in the early 2000s called The Testosterone Files that I read when I was coming out, that my mom read. It existed on her bedside table for a while. And so with each of our collaborators, there are these extraordinary connections between the historical subject and their lived experience. But even more so, what was important to me is that in a documentary where we're really trying to reckon with the politics of visibility, what it means to be seen, what it means to be represented, it was important that we only ask those who were already asking those questions of themselves and their careers. So for those who might be listening and interested in exploring more, you can Google any single one of our collaborators and fall down a glorious rabbit hole of potential, because they're each a kind of portal into their own versions of trans representation and trans history and trans art.
I love that. I love the connecting the stories from the past too with the people in the present and the people helping to create visual representations of those stories. It's so awesome. Why did you decide to do reenactments to retell these particular trans stories? I really loved the modality of the talk show host, and I was just wondering why you chose that.
Yeah, so it's an extension of my earlier answer around thinking about the collision of these contexts between the medical meaning making about trans life and the media making about trans life. And, you know, to be honest, I'm suspicious of archives. I'm suspicious of transcripts. I'm not suspicious of the people, but I'm suspicious of the ways in which we come to know historical subjects. Because one of the things that we explore in the film, and that I know all too well from my own life, is that when we are navigating these contexts of medical gatekeeping, where we have to tell our life story to those in positions of power who serve as gatekeepers to access things that we might need to thrive and survive, we're telling a very conscious version of our life history. We want to make sure we kind of say the right thing, because we've been trained by a culture who tells us there's a wrong way to be. And so already I'm thinking, this is a performance, this is a very strategic performance of a life. So what happens if we take that seriously and actually think about what it means to perform these lives, right? What does it mean to be both accurate to the transcript, but then open up the possibility for interpretation? And so the flipping between contexts is a way for us to hopefully do all things at once, which is to say, yes, we're pulling verbatim from archival transcripts, but also we as trans creators can read between the lines, all the things that aren't on the page, all the things that we intuit or we know with a kind of collective sense of like, this person is saying these words, but they really mean this thing, right? And so these kind of more experimental approaches to documentary help us to crack open the possibilities to tell a variety of different kinds of stories from what seems like a very straightforward foundation of archival material.
I love that. And I thought that was such a just key piece of this film. I love that. Speaking of just like resources, do you have any resources or recommendations on how students, guardians, and educators can learn more about other trans communities and trans histories?
You know, there's so many incredible orgs. So I'm thinking right off the top of my head about orgs in New York, like the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. I'm thinking about the work that Chase Strangio is doing through the ACLU right now. You know, I try to follow portals of trans cultural producers and trans activists on a variety of social media sites, precisely because I understand we're in a moment where people are responding differently to this socioeconomic or sociopolitical pressure. And I don't want to go to only one place for one thing. So I try to cull and keep in conversation with those in my world and in my community.
Yeah, and just speaking on the climate that we're in right now, like with the rise of more anti-trans legislation, what do you hope people take away from your film specifically? Is there anything you hope to inspire in other people, and maybe specifically inspire in trans youth?
You know, I hope that there's so many takeaways in the film. You know, the first one is that we've always been here. We've always been around. We've always been hustling. And the biggest thing for me, the surprise I think that arrives to so many when they see our film, is that we know each other. We're networked, right? We live in a world that tries to isolate and separate trans people in all kinds of ways. And one of the most glorious findings from these archival transcripts was all the ways that the trans people were like, we know each other. We talk about you, doctors. We're actually strategizing behind the scenes to help each other survive. And so I love the whisper networks of trans women that we learn about through someone like Barbara, who say, you know, we show up in each other's hospital rooms as cousins or sisters or friends to make sure that our community is getting the kind of healing care that we need. Or some of the transmasculine subjects in the archive who walk into Garfinkel's office and say, this isn't a line that makes it into the film, but I'll say it here, who says, last night I was at a party with 200 lesbians in the Hollywood Hills. And I could just imagine Garfinkel being like, there's a party in the Hollywood Hills with 200 lesbians, you know, and it's because queer and trans people are the holders of these networks. It's not actually the doctors who have this information. And there's an extraordinary amount of power and an extraordinary amount of resilience in that. But, you know, the emergence of someone like Jules Gill Peterson in our film, our historian to whom we attach to help guide us through these various histories, I think Jules asks a series of really complicated and beautiful questions at the end of the film, which is, you know, what are the limits of visibility? What would it mean to not have to be visible in order to be valued and respected and seen? And they're very, very complicated questions that don't have easy answers. But what I take from that is that we all deserve a right to self-determination and to be able to dial up visibility or dial it back down. And what can we do to help each other be in exactly where we are and to not feel like we need to be ahead of the game in our process or our identities or our transitions or the ways in which we articulate ourselves, and always having the right to change our minds, to feel like we don't have to get it right and that we can try things on and take them back off if they don't feel good and start again.
That brought up a lot for me in terms of also just the power dynamics of historical archives. Really interesting. And I know that this film has done really well. It's screened in person at New Fest and other festivals. Did you want to share any, did anyone share with you, rather, their own research around trans visibility or their own personal stories that you'd like to speak about? Maybe something that someone told you about where this film took them.
Oh, it's such an interesting question. And I think that there's a few different ways to answer it. So one is that we were able to celebrate the film on the weekend of our premiere at Sundance in a backyard in Los Angeles because it was COVID and nobody was in Park City. And a number of our crew and team arrived around a fire pit. I'm not even making it up. It's just true. We just sat around a fire pit. And we were sharing our reflections and our experiences. And I was really overwhelmed by the number of people who said that working on the film, they didn't realize, but in retrospect, was actually a very important part of them working out their own relation to their gender. And that actually being in the company of and in collaboration with a majority queer and trans crew, an all trans cast of collaborators, that there was something happening on and off screen, which is of course a funny thing to say in this film, right? Which is blurring those lines all the time, that was meaningful to them that they didn't quite understand at that time. And I think for me, as someone who's really excited by process, I really think that the process is as, if not more important than the product at the end of the day. That was a very energizing opportunity that I hadn't really known or considered. But then there's also these very unsuspecting engagements and alliances that are emerging from the film. I was in Cleveland last year at the Cleveland International Film Festival, and I was approached by a surgeon who was working at one of the 3 hospitals in the greater Cleveland area and identified himself as such. And I don't know why he was in the room that day, you know, but came up and said, I feel implicated, I feel responsible, I feel called out, and feel energized to think differently about my position in these circumstances, in these rooms. And I was very overwhelmed and very grateful that he approached me to share. And I did not think that, you know, the surgeons of Greater Cleveland were my target audience when making this film. But the relationship between those two things, which happened in very different rooms at very different times, for me is also very significant because, you know, one of the things that I think we come to recognize as filmmakers is that you have all of your best hopes and intentions when you're making a film. You pour your heart and your soul and your tears into it, and it becomes an object that circulates in the world that is no longer yours. And you have to let go of all the things you thought you were doing and pay attention to the things that people are telling you your work is doing. And so allowing it to live as its own body and its own entity and is been a very exciting new path for me to welcome and consider and stay in conversation with.
Yeah, I like that. What people like get from the piece is going to be different than maybe what you even intended in putting in creating it. Always. Yeah, that's the amazing thing about film. So I'm curious for you, what does the future of trans representation in film look like? In your ideal world, what does that look like?
Oh, it's a very big question that we could spend many, many minutes considering. You know, one of the things that I feel most excited by are trans stories that are very clearly organized and led by trans people. I think that we have been inundated by outsider opinions and outsider representations on trans life. And we are in an extraordinary opportunity to tell stories differently and to tell stories collaboratively. And I have become very uninterested in stories about single people. So I'm being flanked by a poster of my film No Ordinary Man here, which is about a transmasculine jazz musician named Billy Tipton. And one of the things we were trying to reckon with is the way that Tipton gets singled out as a person with a certain kind of history. And so one of the strategies we employ in that film is to make sure that we invite a cohort of trans voices, transmasculine voices in particular, to reflect on Tipton's legacy and the significance of someone like Tipton in their own self-understanding. And that's only one of many methods to sort of democratize the playing field of documentary, but I'm very excited to be thinking in multiples. I don't want to tell stories about single people. I don't think that people live in isolation. I think that people have families and lovers and friends and communities, and to represent those alongside the stories of single people really changes how we recognize and come to know about transness in the present moment and also transness in history.
Yeah, I think something I was really amazed about is like just the way that it sort of feels like, you know, how like fungal like grows underground and these sort of connections being made through time and history in the trans community was just really stunning. And I see that in your other films as well. So
I love that. You know, no one's ever gone fungal, but
I'm going fungal.
I really appreciate it. And I will give you, my citational practice is strong. I will say that I took it from you, but I really resonate with it because I think one of the things that's exciting about a much more collaborative and networked relation is that you have to release control over the film that you're making in service of the film that the people you're working with think need to be made. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really energizing and exciting because then the film that emerges, in my opinion, has the potential to resonate with and speak to more people because it is multiply invested from a variety of different vantage points and subject positions.
Right. Yeah, beautifully said. I'm getting a note here that we have a question from the chat.
Yes. My compliments to whoever is in the chat first.
Sarah says, thanks. My GSA students and I were blown away by the film. Is there any testimonial you wanted to include but didn't make it in?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks, Sarah, and all of the GSA students. So, to be honest, one of my favorite things about the transcripts is the sass and humor and sarcastic bite of many of the people who emerge in the clinic at this time. And so I think we have access to some of those incredible lines when, for example, Agnes says, well, why don't you put it in a little box so I can pet it and keep it for the rest of my life when thinking about, you know, gender affirmation surgery, these ways of like really snapping back at the violent curiosity of the doctors. But there are so many versions of this humor that we had to cut some in service of sort of narrative shape. You know, one great example that didn't make it in was when Garfinkel is speaking to Georgia. And Georgia is explaining her desire and her relationship to her husband. Garfinkel asks Georgia if she's ever considered being with a woman. And her response is, you can't get blood out of a turnip. Now, there's a lot of debate about what that means. And I don't even care if we're wrong because it's so funny and it didn't fit in. But, you know, many examples like that of just really strong, impassioned, very funny trans resilience.
I love that. Yeah, I was laughing through parts of the film. I thought people were funny.
Love that. I got to. You know, we have another question, but I just want to say when I'm in the room with people watching the film and there's no laughter, I'm like, oh no, who's here?
Yeah. No, I think that's funny. The comedic timing of these transcripts and the way that they were delivered by the actors. I was laughing. We have one more question. Rachel says, thank you for sharing this story. It was very affirmative for me, and I'm sure for others as well. What do you hope younger students will take away from the film?
Oh, thanks for that question, Rachel. So, the emergence of Jimmy in our film is just such an extraordinary gift to me, to know that Jimmy, a young teenager, was seeking out these services and arrived there with his mother to have these conversations. One of the things that I hope we all experience through Stephen's performance of Jimmy, and also just through Jimmy as Jimmy in the transcripts, is his self-assuredness. It's incredible to me. He knows exactly who he is. He understands that he is not being understood, right? He understands that he's having to teach doctors or speak to his parents differently. And that kind of self-knowing is so inspiring to me. And so when I think about young trans people, young non-binary identifying people, when I think about friends and collaborators, I just want to keep reminding that we know who we are. We might not have the language, we might shift and change who we are, but we are the best truth tellers of our life and our experience. And I think that trans people and non-binary people have extraordinary vision in the world because we are able to analyze and interpret and think for ourselves in very important ways. And so when you're encountering a film like ours, which is trying to operate on a number of different levels, I think that there's a kind of beautiful simplicity to listening to people's words and to recognize the power of their experience and all the ways that we can continue learning from and feel inspired by it today.
Amazing. And thank you for those questions. Last question to end on. Do you have, and you were talking about that in terms of the inspirational aspect, but curious if you have any practical advice for young trans filmmakers.
Oh, okay. I can't believe this is the last question. It should be the first. Okay, so the best piece of advice that I ever got early on in my filmmaking actually was twofold. So the first thing I was going to say is someone said to me, if you want to do something, just try to surround yourself with people who are doing it. Like by virtue of your proximity to them, you're going to learn something and figure something out. So you want to be a filmmaker, but you have no idea what you're doing. Can you start hanging out with people who are making films or in the film world? Because by virtue of that proximity, those conversations, those affective resonances, you're going to start to sort something out. And then my other advice is don't be afraid of making terrible work. Just make whatever you want. Who cares? I think there's such glory in taking risks and making work and telling stories. You're going to look back on it in a couple of years and be like, I've grown a lot. I learned something else. And all of that process is so incredibly dynamic. And I think people feel really terrified of making work that they're not sure is good enough or might not circulate. All of these expectations we put on work before we even start. And the more we can just keep making and keep sharing together, the more we're able to elevate each other's work and therefore elevate our shared commitment to our lives and our communities.
Incredible. Thank you, Chase. That was the last question. So we want to wrap it up and say goodbye to you and thank you for your time. I want to thank again the GSAs for watching the film and for coming to this live stream. Thank you for the questions. And thank you, NewFest, for having me as well. This meant a lot to be here. Longtime fan of NewFest. So it meant a lot. Thank you.
Me too. Thanks, Jude, and thanks, Nick and team. It's great to be here, and thanks for those who are watching.
Bye, everybody.